Hey guys, tonight we are going to pull back the curtain on the darkest chapter of history to witness the horrifying demise of one of England's most tragic and brutal figures, Queen Mary Tudor the First, also known as Bloody Mary. Forget the image of the commanding queen you thought you knew. Tonight, we will step into the damp, foul-smelling chambers of St. James's Palace in the year 1558, where an absolute monarch was being betrayed in the most gruesome way by her own body. This was no quiet passing. It was a prolonged horror show, where jaundiced skin, grotesque swelling, and cries of pain echoed as the perceived price for the blood of nearly 300 people she had burned alive. You will understand how a childhood filled with betrayal and humiliation sowed the seeds for her extreme religious fanaticism and paranoia. We will uncover her medical nightmare and illness, likely cancer, that twice simulated a phantom pregnancy, driving her into a spiral of madness and leading to a rain of blood. Finally, we will witness the tragic spectacle of a queen disintegrating piece by piece, isolated, abandoned by her own husband, and consumed from within by the very fire she used to punish others. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you are and what time it is for you. Are you listening to this story under city lights, or in the quiet dead of night? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the winter of 1558, the frost lay heavy over the halls of St. James's Palace, silencing the usual clamouring of courtiers and replacing it with a hush of dread. Where once the corridors had rung with the clang of armour and the rustle of silk, now there was only the faint murmur of those too afraid to speak loudly. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if unwilling to disturb the grim scene unfolding within those ornate walls. For Mary Tudor, the woman history would call Bloody Mary, she no longer resembled the regal monarch who had once glowed with royal bearing. Her skin had turned a sallow yellow, stretched tightly across her bones like aged parchment. Every inch of her flesh bore the mark of slow decay, as though her body were being unstitched, thread by painful thread, by a force utterly beyond her control. And yet, her heart continued to beat, each pulse a cruel reminder of the life still trapped within that ravaged form. At 42 years old, Mary had outlived many of her contemporaries, yet she was dying in the most grotesque and horrifying manner imaginable. The very courtiers who had once knelt before her gentlewomen in their silken gowns, knights in polished armour, now recoiled in silent terror at the sight of their sovereign. Some wept behind their hands, tears glinting in the cold torchlight, while others trembled so badly they could scarcely hold their heads upright. It was a sorrowful irony that the queen who had ordered hundreds of her subjects to the flames for their heretical beliefs would herself burn from within, consumed by a disease whose true nature no learned physician could name with certainty. Whispered rumours among the most informed doctors spoke of cancer of the womb or the liver, yet none could offer solace or relief. Each shallow breath Mary drew seemed to feed the fire raging beneath her skin, a fire no priestly blessing could quench. Flies swarmed about her, their buzzing a macabre chorus to her suffering. The stench of rot was so powerful that even heavily perfumed attendants found themselves gagging, tears sliding down their cheeks as they fanned the air in desperate attempts to clear their senses. Such was the stench of flesh falling into ruin that some whispered the very stones of the palace grew damp with the moisture of decay, as though the walls themselves recoiled from the horror they contained. But this was not the end of Mary's story in the records of headlines or royal proclamations. Instead, it was the brutal finale to a life marked by betrayal, anguish, and unshakable religious zeal. Her journey from princess to persecutor had been paved with humiliation and scars both of the body and of the soul. Now, in her final months, that same fervour bent her mind into a spiral of mania and paranoia. Shadows seemed to dance at the edges of her vision, and she would mutter prayers to saints who offered no reply. She summoned her council only to accuse them of plotting her demise, convinced that Protestant conspirators sought to poison her at every turn. Candlelight trembled across her gaunt face as she raved of divine torment, of a personal purgatory manifested in every pang of agony that racked her bowels, every spasm that contorted her limbs. No rank or station could protect her from this terrible affliction. In the Tudor age, illness did not discriminate between king and commoner. The hand of fate was equally cruel to all, and so Mary found herself, once the wielder of absolute power, utterly powerless against the decrees of nature. Day by day, her flesh surrendered to the relentless advance of disease, her mind a fragile vessel shattered by pain. Through it all, she clung stubbornly to the rituals of her faith, yet those rituals offered no reprieve. The very fires she had once kindled in the name of religious purity now mirrored the internal blaze that devoured her from the inside out. And as her story inched toward its atrocious end, the world watched not the farewell of a queen in regal splendor, but the collapse of a woman besieged by forces that no mortal could tame. Before Mary's flesh began its dreadful unraveling, her life had already been woven with upheaval. Born in 1516 as the cherished daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she spent her earliest years bathed in affection and privilege. In the glittering courts of London, she was a symbol of royal pride and papal favour, doted on by tutors and courtiers alike. Every corridor of palaces Greenwich, Windsor, and Hampton Court echoed with lullabies sung for the young princess, and her cradle, swaddled in fine linen, was placed beneath tapestries depicting saintly virtues. But that bright promise flickered and died when Henry, ever the indulgent king, fell under the sway of Anne Boleyn. In a swift, brutal stroke of statecraft, he annulled his marriage to Catherine, cast aside the queen he had once proclaimed his true wife, and declared young Mary illegitimate. Overnight, the princess was stripped of her title and her inheritance, demoted to a lady-in-waiting for her infant half-sister, Elizabeth. The gilded cage of her childhood palace became a prison of humiliation, and where once she had commanded respect, she now bowed her head at every beck and whisper. That degradation did not end at mere ceremony. Mary was placed under watchful eyes, her letters intercepted and read by spies, her footsteps followed by silent attendants ready to report any sign of defiance. Should she dare to challenge her father's edicts, she faced unspoken threats to her very life. Meanwhile, Catherine was exiled to remote, austere castles, lonesome towers perched on cold cliffs where illness and heartbreak claimed her in solitude, the salt spray of the sea her only companion. News of her mother's suffering reached Mary in half whispers, fueling both grief and fury. Isolated and embittered, Mary found solace in the only steadfast companion at her side: her faith. Catholic rituals, Latin prayers, and devout observances became the bulwark of her spirit. Yet the weight of constant surveillance and unrelenting fear took its toll not only on her heart but on her body. Reports speak of her suffering from irregular menstruation, crippling headaches, and bouts of deep melancholy. Even the most compassionate of her caretakers noted that she was never quite the same child after Catherine's banishment. The flowering promise of youth had been trampled underfoot by royal exigency. Betrayal taught Mary a ruthless calculus, that love could be weaponized, mercy a liability. From then on, she vowed that if she one day held power, she would never allow herself or her realm to be at the mercy of another's caprice. Iron-fisted control, she reasoned, was the only safeguard against the chaos of affection gone awry. The break with Rome in 1534 struck at her soul. Henry's act of supremacy severed England from the Catholic Church, and Mary, bound by blood and conviction, was forced to attend Protestant services she believed profaned the divine. Each hymn sung in English felt like sacrilege. Each psalm recited in a tongue she scarcely understood cut her spirit like a blade. She knelt through unfamiliar rites, her heart pounding with shame, her eyes brimming with silent tears. Thus began her self-imposed exile within her own land. Removed from positions of influence, she retreated inward, pouring herself into private devotions, reading medieval theology by candlelight late into the night. The flicker of flame would dance across her downcast face as she whispered the same prayers again and again, hoping to staunch the ache in her chest. In those dark hours, a fierce longing blossomed, an unshakable thirst to restore the light of Rome to England's shadowed shores. That longing, nurtured by years of rejection and sorrow, would grow into a singular purpose: to reclaim the kingdom for her faith. It burned quietly at first, like embers beneath ash, but with each passing year, it found oxygen in her resentments. She imagined highways lined with statues of saints, cathedrals ablaze with incense, and the return of the Mass in Latin, the truest expression of divine worship. And so, when at last the chance arrived to ascend the throne, Mary carried within her the full weight of adolescence lost and faith imperiled. Her heart, hardened by pain and fortified by conviction, set her on a path that would shape her reign and sow the seeds of tragedy that would later engulf her. In the quiet of her solitude, long before her final illness took hold, Mary Tudor's destiny was already written in ink and blood, a testament to the indelible scars left by betrayal, exile, and the relentless pursuit of redemption. In the year 1544, Mary Tudor was restored to her rightful place as heir apparent, yet the wounds of her spirit ran deeper than any court intrigue could heal. No longer the radiant princess of her childhood, she had become a woman hollowed by betrayal, her capacity for trust and affection eroded by years of exile and sorrow. Though the court once greeted her return with feigned smiles and courteous bows, Mary carried within her a bitterness that no pageant of pomp could mask. 9 years later, in 1553, at the age of 37, Mary ascended the throne amid great expectation and tremendous pressure. Her singular mission was to produce the child of God, an heir who would restore England to the fold of Rome and undo the schism begun by her father's repudiation of the papacy. This purpose consumed every waking thought and, it seemed, even her dreams. She envisioned a Catholic England reborn, cathedrals redressed in velvet, priests vested in golden brocade, the Mass returned to its ancient Latin solemnities. To fulfill this destiny, Mary entered into marriage with Philip II of Spain, a union of statecraft rather than romance. The ceremony took place in a glacial atmosphere of diplomatic caution, the corridors lined with uneasy nobles watching the strangers pledge their troth. Philip, 11 years her junior, was a man of cool ambition, his eyes calculating the weight of alliances rather than the warmth of companionship. Yet Mary placed all her hope in him, convinced that in his arms she would find not only political partnership, but the longed-for promise of motherhood. In the weeks that followed, a flicker of hope illuminated the court. Mary's belly began to swell as though under a secret canopy of expectation. She grew pale and queasy at dawn, her hand pressed to her stomach as though cradling an unseen child. Physicians, summoned from Paris and Antwerp, pronounced her pregnancy credible. Their learned nods sufficed to set the royal household into feverish preparation. A chamber was readied for childbirth. Midwives and wet nurses were named, and silken swaddling cloths were stitched with prayers and hopeful blessings. But as the months wore on, the silence of childbirth remained, as hollow as the chambers that awaited it. Month after month, Mary knelt in the private chapel, fingers woven in prayer, calling upon saints and martyrs to grant her the miracle she so desperately sought. Courtiers watched one another with thinly veiled suspicion. Whispers circulated that the Queen's hopes were built upon sand, that her body was deceiving her as cruelly as her father once had. Elizabethan ambassadors abroad transmitted hints of unease, cautioning their masters that Mary's great expectation might be naught but a royal charade. To modernize, it seems likely that Mary suffered from tumours of the ovary or uterus, growths that mimicked pregnancy through hormonal shifts, causing both distension of the abdomen and waves of nausea. In the 16th century, however, no soul dared speak such a blunt truth. Physicians offered soothing remedies, infusions of rosemary, poultices of rue, yet beneath their carefully practiced faces, none truly believed that a child would ever come. Each failed month deepened Mary's despair and twisted her convictions. She came to believe that her phantom pregnancies were divine punishments, evidence of her kingdom's lingering sin. In her mind, the unborn heir had been withheld by divine decree until England was purged of heresy. Thus, she proclaimed, it was her sacred duty to burn away every ember of Protestant dissent. The same zeal that drove her to construct funeral pyres now ignited her resolve. She would stoke the flames of persecution until the purifying fire made way for the promised miracle. In the hush of candlelit galleries, Mary conferred with her council about new edicts to apprehend heretics, her voice unwavering as she outlined lists of names to be summoned before ecclesiastical courts. Yet behind the amber glass of the chapel's stained windows, her face would twist with anguish as the realization of her own body's failure sank in once more. She stood at the precipice of faith and fanaticism, convinced that the only path to salvation lay through the crucible of suffering. And so, in the solemn hush that enveloped her court, the Queen moved between hope and dread, her every breath a prayer for a life that would never be. The child she yearned to hold remained a spectre, haunting both her chambers and her dreams. In the stillness of those months, Mary Tudor found herself both sovereign of a realm and captive to her own despair. A woman whose destiny was bound inexorably to the promise and torment of motherhood never fulfilled. In the year 1557, Queen Mary made a solemn proclamation of her second pregnancy. Though learned physicians in her court had long ceased to believe in the matter, none dared to speak the unpalatable truth. With great ceremony, Mary arranged a Thanksgiving Mass in the palace chapel, the incense curling through the vaulting arches as priests chanted Latin hymns of praise. She even selected godparents, noble lords and ladies who bowed with respectful smiles, though their eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt at the charade. The swaddling clothes lay folded on a cushioned bench, awaiting a child who would never arrive. As the months slipped by without a single pang of labour, the veneer of hope cracked. Whispers spread through the corridors that the Queen's promise was empty, that her body mocked her faith. When the day came to admit there was no child, Mary's grief metastasized into a furious despair. She paced the gallery lined with tapestries, her skirts whispering over the marble floor, her face flushed with rage. In her mind, the phantom pregnancies were divine reprimands, evidence that England's lingering heresy must be purged before heaven could grant her longed-for miracle. Thus ignited, the flames of persecution burned hotter than ever. The Marian persecutions, which had begun in 1555, now reached their apex. Over the course of 3 relentless years, nearly 300 men, women, and even children of the Protestant faith were led to the pyre in public squares, Smithfield, Canterbury, and many a market town, and burned alive in spectacles of terror. No corner of the realm was spared the acrid smoke and the cries of the condemned. Among those consigned to the flames was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the very prelate who had declared Mary's parents divorced. He was held in the old prison tower, gaunt and unbowed, awaiting his inevitable fate. On the day of his execution, witnesses said he accepted his sentence with calm dignity. As the kindling crackled and the fire roared around him, he lifted his right hand, the same hand that had signed the annulment, and plunged it into the flames first, recanting his recantations in a final act of defiance. Mary, observing from a raised platform draped in crimson and gold, allowed herself a rare smile. It was one of the few moments she tasted genuine satisfaction in her reign. Yet the true horror lay in Mary's personal management of the trials themselves. She insisted on reviewing the pleadings of each accused heretic, poring over transcripts by candlelight, her brow furrowed with solemn purpose. She demanded that interrogations be rigorous, believing that forced recantation preserved the sinner's soul even as their body burned. In letters to her husband, Philip of Spain, and to high-ranking church officials on the continent, she described the tortures and executions as medicine for a spiritually sick England. "Let the flames cleanse the land," she wrote, "that the pure faith may flourish once more." Diplomats standing behind her, in their velvet cloaks, stifled gasps at the vehemence of her words. Yet Mary held fast to her conviction. Every pyre constructed, every heretic's final scream, was a step toward the restoration of the Church. She viewed each funeral pyre as a sacrament, each plume of smoke a prayer rising upward. Hers was a vision of salvation writ in fire and ash. Still, not all within her council shared her zealotry. Some envoys begged for moderation, pleading that the cruelty only fueled Protestant resistance abroad. Reports filtered in of secret prayer meetings in private homes, of clandestine Bibles passed from hand to trembling hand. The more Mary burned, the firmer the resolve of those she sought to terrify. Yet she would brook no delay. In her eyes, compromise was tantamount to failure, a concession that risked the wrath of God himself. Under the glare of torchlight, she signed edicts ordering the seizure of property belonging to convicted heretics, redirecting their lands and wealth to reward loyal Catholic nobles. The coffers of Rome swelled with tribute, while secret Protestant networks formed in the shadows. And Mary, for all her outward confidence, could not extinguish the flicker of doubt in her own heart. Thus the kingdom hung in the balance of fire and faith. Mary Tudor, once the gentle daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, had become an emissary of fiery judgment. Yet the embers of Protestantism endured, stubborn beneath the ashes. And so, in the silent watches of the night, when the last flicker of torchlight died, and the wind whispered through empty streets, Mary's soul stood alone amid the ruins of her own making, caught between a devotion that demanded sacrifice and a sorrow that no flame could ever consume. Though Mary's inferno of persecution raged with relentless fury, it did not extinguish the spirit of her Protestant subjects. Instead, the martyrs she offered up upon the pyres became legends, whispered behind closed doors and carried like secrets in the night. Tales spread of men and women clasping crosses as the flames licked their feet, singing psalms in their final breaths, defying death itself in a testament to their unyielding faith. These stories nourished a growing resistance. Clandestine congregations formed in hidden chambers, and secret sermons were delivered under the hush of midnight. Alarmed by this steadfast defiance, Mary's wrath deepened. She accused her most trusted advisers of harboring sympathy for the very heresy she sought to stamp out. Noblemen who had once sat at her table found themselves eyed with suspicion, their private prayers presumed acts of treason. An atmosphere of distrust blossomed in courtiers' hearts, as any word spoken in confidence might land one upon a scaffold, or so they feared. Even the Pope, the Holy Father in Rome, sent urgent missives urging moderation. He cautioned that the reputation of the Church was at stake, that such brutal displays would stain Catholicism's image across Europe. Yet Mary, convinced that only fire could purify the realm, dismissed these entreaties as the counsel of timid men. She believed the flames were divinely sanctioned, a necessary scourge to cleanse England's soul. Meanwhile, her husband, Philip of Spain, grew increasingly distant. Embarrassed by Mary's fanatic fervour and the mounting scandal abroad, he spent more and more time in his own quarters or on diplomatic missions away from London. Letters from his court spoke of his embarrassment, of nobles questioning his judgment for allying with a queen whose reign was now synonymous with terror and smoke. As the political support faded, Mary's body betrayed her in even more visible ways. Her skin, once a rosy hue softened by candlelight, turned a dull yellow. Her eyes, clouded with illness, struggled to focus on those who approached her. Her belly, once distended by the hope of a child, now swelled with fluid and pain, rigid as a stone slab. Night after night, she wandered the palace corridors in agony, her gown trailing behind her like a tattered banner. Each step brought waves of nausea and spasms that twisted her limbs, leaving her grasping at the stone walls for support. Her digestive system collapsed under the strain. Bouts of violent diarrhea alternated with crippling constipation, each attack more excruciating than the last. Food became both sustenance and curse. Almost every morsel returned in bitter regurgitation, the air thick with the stench of decay that clung to her robes and hair. Attendants took turns caring for her, but many could not endure the smell or the sight for long. They whispered amongst themselves, offering prayers between shifts to sustain their courage. Yet Mary, though ravaged by pain and shame, refused to relinquish her authority. She held court from her bed, summoning ambassadors and noblemen to her chamber. Diplomats, their stomachs churning, dared not refuse her summons. They knelt beside her bedside table, papers trembling in their hands. The very breath that left her lips carried an odour so foul that some officials discreetly covered their noses, hoping to survive their audience without losing their composure. In these grim encounters, Mary's voice, once strong and commanding, had dwindled to a fragile whisper. Each syllable seemed to cost her a drop of blood or a gasp of air. Still, she spoke of miracles and divine tests, invoking the saints as witnesses to her suffering. Her frail frame, draped in brocade, was a stark reminder that the queen who once wielded power over life and death was herself dying in slow torment. Surprisingly, even her staunchest enemies found compassion stirring in their hearts. The same courtiers who had plotted around her table now exchanged pitying glances, unable to recall when they last saw Mary unburdened by agony. Some bowed, tears welling in their eyes, as they left her presence, their roles as agents of state becoming secondary to the simple humanity awakened by her misery. And so, in the dim glow of her chamber's flickering candles, Mary Tudor remained at the crossroads of vengeance and empathy. She clung to her prayers, convinced that faith would deliver her at last. All the while, her body continued its ghastly transformation. Cheeks sunken, lips cracked and bleeding, eyes hollow with both devotion and despair. In her suffering, she became more mortal than ever, a sovereign laid bare before the merciless reckoning of nature and the persistent echo of her own unquenchable flames. By the time autumn's chill settled over London in September of 1558, Mary Tudor's body had become little more than a hollow vessel for unrelenting suffering. Her once sallow skin had deepened to a shade of greenish blue, pocked with patches of gangrene that oozed foul-smelling discharge. Those ruptured lesions on her engorged abdomen had torn through the fine silk of her gowns, staining the royal brocade with dark, crusted marks of decay. The very sheets of her bed were saturated with exudate, and the stench was so overpowering that even her most devoted ladies-in-waiting succumbed to nausea, retreating to the corridors with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. It became necessary to change her bedding several times each day, for none could endure more than a brief watch before trading places with another reluctant attendant. Her belly, swollen to the size of a melon, no longer fit within the lavish folds of her royal robes. Seamstresses were summoned at odd hours to slice seams and add panelling, yet even this was barely enough to accommodate the cruel distension. Physicians who had once studied anatomy with pride now exchanged grim nods. They suspected that tumours had spread into her liver, blocking the flow of bile and causing her jaundice to deepen into a sickly tapestry of green and yellow. Her pores, clogged with perspiration and blood, leaked drops of hot fluid that sizzled against fabric. Every contortion of her body produced a hoarse moan, a half shudder, half cramp that echoed through the candlelit chambers. Pain so profound robbed her of the ability to lie fully down. Instead, she remained half reclined in a gilded wooden chair, its weight a harsh contrast to the fragility of her flesh. In her waking hours, Mary's mind drifted between lucidity and delirium. One moment she would mutter of flame of being bound upon a pyre as tongues of fire enveloped her, and she screamed name after name in plea for salvation that never came. The next, she was certain she saw Christ standing before her throne, an ethereal glow surrounding his form, soothing her with promises of eternal glory in exchange for earthly torment. This interplay of religious ecstasy and tormenting hallucination deepened her confusion, leaving her unable to distinguish reality from the visions that haunted her. The court, once abuzz with political machinations, now avoided the Queen's chambers as though entering a plague house. Only matters of state could draw them near ambassadors whose business was urgent knelt before her bedside, braving the noxious fumes. They coughed and bowed, papers trembling in their hands as Mary, with a shaky hand, signed decrees to close Protestant meeting houses and arrest suspected dissidents. Her handwriting, scrawled in thick, blurred ink, bore the tremor of a hand worn thin by pain. And yet, she wielded her authority until her final days, summoning ministers and generals to do her bidding, despite the visible decay of her body. When questioned about her health, Mary would reply in a faint, measured tone, "The balance of heaven and earth is without fault," as though her own decrepit form were part of some divine equilibrium. In her heart, she believed this affliction to be the ultimate test of her faith and the final trial in her sacred mission to redeem England. But even her most loyal counsellors could see the truth. Mary stood at the precipice of despair, her judgment clouded by agony. The rituals of prayer that once fortified her now circled endlessly in her mind like a broken hymn, offering no comfort beyond their familiar cadence. In the hush of night, when the palace corridors lay silent except for the crackle of dying candles, Mary's chamber became a mausoleum of sorrow. The wind would sigh through the shutters, carrying the scent of roasting chestnuts from the kitchens, an aroma that once signified warmth and festivity, now a grim reminder of life outside her prison of flesh. Occasionally, a gentle knock would herald the arrival of a weary attendant bearing a crucifix or a vial of holy water, hoping to soothe her with sacrament. Mary would grasp their wrist with surprising strength, her eyes lighting with desperate need, only to falter as another spasm twisted through her abdomen. It was in those lonely interludes that Mary, the sovereign of England, found her humanity laid bare. Stripped of splendour, she was a woman besieged by the very forces she had once wielded against others. As her reign wavered between the ritual of power and the ritual of pain, the echoes of her past of crowns and coronations grew faint. In their place rose a single, plaintive truth, that no mortal, regardless of station, could evade the ravages of nature. And so, in this dark chapter of her life, Mary Tudor lay suspended between devotion and delirium, her soul a fragile beacon flickering in the autumn gloom. By the end of October 1558, Mary Tudor's strength had all but ebbed away. The gangrenous rot that first darkened her abdomen now crept along her limbs, blackening fingers and toes until they shriveled like withered vines. Physicians, aghast at the sight, resorted to delicate surgery severing tendons beneath her nails, so the jagged edges would not pierce the soft, rotting flesh beneath. Yet Mary, cradling her faith as intimately as she did her crown, refused to allow the removal of even a single nail. She insisted that every part of her body, however corrupted, was wrought by divine will, and must remain intact until her final breath. Night after night, her agonized moans echoed through the labyrinthine corridors of the palace. At times, delirium would seize her, and she would cry out, "I shall triumph over sin," only to collapse back against her pillows in a jarring fit of convulsions. Sleep had become a distant, fragile gift snatches of uneasy rest, upon a specially designed chair, piled high with cushions, each one a feeble barrier against the relentless waves of pain. The prolonged torture of her illness left permanent scars upon her nervous system, birthing vivid hallucinations of roaring infernos, savage beasts, and demonic shadows that danced just beyond the glow of flickering candles. The royal household, stretched thin by the crisis, divided itself into two wary camps. One faction focused on the relentless demands of governance, ensuring that war plans, taxes, and state communications continued despite the Queen's condition. The other dedicated itself to her care, administering every folk remedy known to 16th century medicine salves of mugwort, poultices made of charcoal and ginger, draughts of fever-reducing cordial. Yet each application, meant to soothe, only intensified her agony. Ointment scorched the fragile tissue of her sores, causing fresh blisters that wept foul-smelling fluid. When servants gently pressed a linen cloth soaked in vinegar and claret to her wounds, Mary would lash out in fury, slapping the very hands that sought to heal, as though punishing them for daring to touch her divinely ordained flesh. Amid this personal hell, the machinery of state creaked and groaned under the looming question of succession. Elizabeth, once Mary's demoted half-sister, waited in the modest chambers where she had served long ago as a lady-in-waiting. Word of Mary's dwindling days reached her softly at first. Whispers in the Privy Council, hurried letters delivered under seal. Behind the velvet curtains, officials moved to digitize the instruments of power. Inventories of the royal coffers were tallied by candlelight. Ecclesiastical edicts were drafted to realign the church with the new regime, and alliances across Europe were discreetly cemented in preparation for a seamless transition. Some of Mary's most cherished counsellors, despite their deep respect for her person, began clandestine talks with Elizabeth's supporters. They understood that without a clear and lawful handover, England might descend into chaos. Their fears were not unfounded. Protestant factions, emboldened by Mary's waning authority, plotted peaceful demonstrations aimed at preventing further persecution. Yet these plans remained fragile dreams, for Mary's grip on life was so tenuous that any uprising would risk turning peaceful protest into tragic spectacle. As the days wore on, the palace became a place of hushed tension. Servants scurried like shadows through dimly lit halls, clutching letters sealed with the royal crest. The great carved doors of the council chamber stood ready to swing open at a moment's notice. Ambassadors from France, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond remained poised in the antechamber, their nerveless fingers drumming on wooden tables as they awaited a summons that might never come. And through it all, Mary clung to ritual. Each dawn found her lips moving in Latin, invoking the names of saints and martyrs whose blood had once watered these same stone floors. She believed her suffering to be the ultimate penance, a final proof of her devotion and the necessary crucible before England's rebirth. Yet in the quiet of her fever dreams, doubt flickered. Was her death truly the path to salvation, or the tragic fulfillment of a crusade gone awry? In the gathering shadow of her life's twilight, Mary Tudor's legacy hung in precarious balance. Around her, the world prepared for a new dawn under Elizabeth's rule. Protestant preachers stoked hope in hidden chapels, while Catholic bishops wept for their sovereign in the dying glow of her lantern-lit bedchamber. Soon the question would no longer be how Mary had ruled, but how she would die, and whether her final sacrifice would at last unlock the doors of mercy she had long withheld. On the 10th of November, in the waning light of dusk, Mary Tudor slipped into a deep, unbroken coma that stretched on for hours. Her lips, parched and cracked, lay slightly parted as though whispering prayers unheard. Veins, black and swollen, traced a web beneath her skin, pulsing faintly with a life that seemed as tenuous as a candle's flame in a storm. Physicians gathered around her bed, their faces drawn in candlelight, listening intently to the slowing rhythm of her heart. Each beat was a deliberate act of defiance against the decay that gnawed at her flesh. And when they probed her wrist for a pulse, they often waited in tense silence before the faint throb could be discerned. Within the depths of her coma, Mary's mind drifted back to the innocence of childhood. She wandered again through the pebbled courtyards of her youth, where Catherine's gentle laughter once echoed under summer skies. She felt the soft weight of her mother's hand upon her shoulder as Latin prayers drifted through vaulted chapels. Then, in the shifting haze of dream, she was forced to her knees before her father Henry, as he declared her unworthy and cast her out from her birthright. The pain of that moment tore at her anew, and in her unconscious state she cried aloud, calling Catherine's name with desperate fervour, begging forgiveness for the sins she felt she had committed against innocence itself. All the while, bishops and clerics took turns at her bedside, chanting the ancient rites of the Mass in a steady procession of hope. The low drone of their voices wove through the stone corridors, each Latin intonation a plea for divine intervention. Scents of frankincense and myrrh thickened the air, clinging to tapestries and gown sleeves, but their sweetness could not mask the foul odour that rose from Mary's failing body. Yet, in the hush of that solemn vigil, no reply came to the cleric's prayers, except the gentle sigh of shifting curtains and the distant toll of cathedral bells. It was only when a hand, white-robed and trembling with compassion, touched her fevered brow that Mary stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing glassy eyes that took a moment to recognize the faces around her. With a faint, hoarse whisper, she murmured a final act of contrition, a broken, "I forgive," as though releasing a burden she had carried through her reign. Then, her gaze softened, as if resting briefly in some vision beyond mortal suffering, before it closed once more in stillness. News of the Queen's perilous condition reached Elizabeth in her modest lodging not by triumphant heralds, but by sombre dispatches. The princess, who had once knelt at Mary's feet, now heard that hope was all but lost. Elizabeth sent forth her most trusted aide, a dignitary well versed in courtly decorum, to attend the bedside examination and formally witness the Queen's final moments. The envoy, his hand quivering as he affixed the royal seal to the letter of death, departed with heavy steps, carrying tidings that would soon ripple through the realm. Though Elizabeth waited anxiously for confirmation, she did not linger beside her sister's chamber door. Instead, she quietly directed preparations for her own ascension, ensuring that every jewel, crown, and parchment was ready for the ceremony to follow. In her composure lay a measured grief, respectful of Mary's suffering yet resolute in her duty to assume the crown. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, an ironclad mandate went forth. The news of Mary's impending demise was to remain secret until the very moment her heart ceased to beat. Soldiers continued their stately patrols along the battlements, their pikes glinting like silent sentries, as though the Queen still commanded from her throne. Couriers were instructed to retrieve and secure all confidential dispatches, and to seal every letter bound for foreign courts. Diplomats, who lingered in anterooms with bated breath, sensed the tension but dared not inquire further. In these final hours, the palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Torches burned lower in the vast halls, their flickering light casting long shadows upon the marble floors. The once boisterous clamour of State Council gave way to hushed footsteps and muffled voices. Everything pointed to the inevitable. The reign of Mary Tudor was drawing to its close, and with it, the tumultuous chapter of persecution, phantom pregnancies, and devout cruelty. Soon the threshold would be crossed, and England would stand on the precipice of a new dawn under Elizabeth's gentle yet unyielding hand. On the morning of November 17th, as dawn's pale light filtered through the high windows, Mary Tudor drew her final breath. It was precisely 6 o'clock when the attending physician, reclining by the bedside, noted the cessation of her heartbeat. Mary sat propped in her gilded chair, the linens and cushions newly arranged in a final, solemn gesture of care. No cries or lamentations broke the hush, only the faint flicker of a single candle in the corner, its flame quivering like a last teardrop. The courtiers, doctors, and bishops present watched in respectful silence, their faces bowed, as they performed the ancient rite of observing the breath. When no subtle movement of chest nor quiver of wing-shaped throats could be detected, they released a collective sigh of sorrow that seemed to shudder through the very stones of the chamber. The lead physician recorded the official observation in his ledger. No neurological response. Pulse ceased completely. Cardiac motion halted. At that moment, the bells of Westminster Abbey pealed out across the waking city, their deep tolls tolling the news of the Queen's passing. Yet unlike the boisterous grief that sometimes accompanies a monarch's death, the reaction was muted. Londoners paused in their routines, heads bowed in mourning and apprehension rather than wailing in uncontrolled sorrow. Many wrapped black kerchiefs about their faces and stood quietly before the grand oak and gilded coffin that awaited its occupant. Mary's body was prepared for entombment according to venerable customs. A mixture of salt and aromatic herbs, rosemary, thyme, and myrrh, was used to preserve her remains. She lay in state for 3 days, allowing mourners a final opportunity to pay their respects before her coffin was conveyed to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower of London. Outside the palace gates, banners hung at half-mast, and soldiers stood in rigid formation, truncheons held at their sides in solemn tribute. The procession that accompanied her to the chapel was modest in length. The privileged few members of the Privy Council, high-ranking nobles and foreign envoys walked beside the coach, while commoners watched from a respectful distance, reluctant to approach too closely for fear of the lingering odour of decay. At the moment the coffin was lowered into the crypt, a single, prolonged toll of the abbey's bells reverberated through the dank air. There was no grand state funeral with rousing trumpets and martial drums. Instead, the service was conducted in the simplicity of Catholic rite. Prayers were intoned in low, resonant voices. A handful of dried rose petals was scattered across the coffin's lid, and a simple wooden cross was placed upon it. The dim glow of beeswax candles revealed the contours of her catafalque, and shadows seemed to pool in every corner, as if darkness itself bent to cradle the fallen queen. In the hush that followed, only the whispered recitation of the Lord's Prayer and the Our Lady's salutation could be heard, each word laden with solemnity. The officiating clergy, their chasubles heavy with embroidered images of saints, moved with deliberate reverence, their feet treading softly upon ancient flagstones. Their voices, rising and falling in Latin, spun a tapestry of sacred song that wrapped the tomb in a shroud of devotion. Outside, the wind skirled through the tower's arrow slits, carrying a faint promise of change, even as Mary Tudor's reign lay entombed beneath layers of cold stone. Thus ended the life of the monarch called Bloody Mary, not with triumph or a final royal proclamation, but in a quietly sombre rite that honoured her station and acknowledged the frailty of her mortal frame. The candles guttered as the clergy filed out, and the heavy door of the crypt creaked closed, sealing Mary's legacy within the walls where so much royal intrigue had unfolded. All was still, save for the distant echo of church bells and the soft patter of footsteps retreating into the grey light of a world poised on the brink of a new dawn. Immediately following the sombre rites of Mary Tudor's burial, the machinery of state sprang into urgent motion. In a quiet chamber, lit by pale morning light, the Privy Council assembled to affirm the rightful succession. There, Elizabeth I formally took her oath to uphold the laws and liberties of England, putting an end to the brutal persecutions that had scarred the realm. Where official correspondence once bore the seal Maria Regina, every document was swiftly restamped Elizabeth Regina in elegant script. It was a symbolic shift as profound as the changing of seasons, announcing to all Europe that the age of Mary's fiery piety had passed, and a new era of tolerance would dawn. On the 15th of December, 1558, Westminster Abbey's lofty nave filled with light and song as Elizabeth was crowned Queen of England, in a ceremony that blended medieval pageantry with a fresh spirit of renewal. Her coronation robes, woven in vibrant shades of green and white, the colours of her house swirled around her as she moved beneath the gaze of carved saints and angels in the vaulted ceiling. The very air seemed to hum with expectation, as if the ancient stones of the abbey rejoiced at the arrival of this young monarch, whose reign promised restoration and rebirth. Though resentment toward Mary's memory lingered in shadowed corners, Elizabeth acted swiftly to heal divisions. She issued blanket pardons for Protestant prisoners still languishing in dank jails. Men and women who had faced the flames for their faith were now free to return home. The royal proclamation carried a message of reconciliation. Let those who erred be met with mercy, that the realm may emerge united and strong. In the weeks that followed, Protestant congregations reopened in hushed reverence where smoke once curled from funeral pyres. Ministers clad in simple black gowns led services in English, their voices raising hymns of praise rather than pleas for deliverance. Simultaneously, the machinery of Catholic infrastructure was quietly dismantled. Monasteries, once bustling with monks and nuns, found their doors locked and their lands seized by the crown. The great abbeys of Westminster and Glastonbury fell silent beneath shifting flags of green and white. Priests loyal to Rome faced exile or removal from office, and cathedral staffs were reconfigured to align with the new Church of England. Statues of saints were taken down, altars were stripped of icons, and the ink of Reformation edicts seeped into every corner of governance. Court painters swiftly captured Elizabeth's visage on canvas, her posture dignified, her eyes steady, with a crown of gold perched upon her auburn hair. In contrast, Mary's image faded from public view. Coins minted with her likeness melted down and recast, her portraits relegated to dusty storerooms. Still, among the whispered tales of England's transition, the name Bloody Mary became enshrined as a cautionary epitaph. She was remembered as the queen whose zeal burned too fiercely, a monarch whose quest for purity consumed both her subjects and ultimately her own flesh. Yet, as the decades unfolded, historians sought to re-examine Mary's life in gentler light. Some chroniclers pointed to the scars of her youth, her abrupt demotion, the exile of her mother, the pangs of betrayal as crucibles that forged her steely resolve. Others noted the phantom pregnancies and the relentless illness that gnawed at her years, arguing that her tyranny sprang from profound suffering rather than mere malice. These interpretations did not excuse her actions, but endeavoured to place them within the context of a woman shaped by pain and politics. Still, none could erase the haunting image of Mary's final days. The Queen, once adorned in sumptuous velvet and pearls, reduced to a vessel of decay upon a bed of silk, her body ravaged by disease, while her mind clung to prayers of deliverance. That vision endured in collective memory, a spectral reminder of the cost of unyielding conviction. It served as a sombre chapter in England's grand narrative, one that Elizabeth herself acknowledged in a quiet moment before her own mirror. She is said to have whispered a prayer for her sister's soul, mindful that the stability she enjoyed was born from the ashes of Mary's tragedy. Thus closed the book on Mary Tudor's reign, but its pages remained stained with tears and embers. England moved forward under Elizabeth's measured hand, yet the legacy of Bloody Mary lingered like a cautionary tale whispered at bedtime, a story of power and suffering, zeal and regret, preserved in the hush of history and the flickering shadows of candle-lit corridors. After the coronation of Elizabeth I, England seemed to awaken beneath the gentle warmth of an early spring sun, as though the very air had breathed a sigh of relief. In scarcely more than a fortnight, Parliament convened in solemn session to enact the Act of Restitution for St. Edward's Synod, a law that struck down every penalty Mary had imposed for heresy. Where once the iron bars of London's prisons had clanged with the despairing cries of Protestant captives, hundreds of men and women now walked free into the pale sunshine, their fetters removed and their hearts lightened. They returned to their families in silent jubilation, embracing parents and children in tearful reunions, and then made their way to reopened chapels where they sang psalms once more in the English tongue, liturgy and melody replacing the crackle of pyres and the anguished shrieks that had once stained the public squares. Meanwhile, the vast network of Catholic houses, abbeys, priories and convents crumbled beneath the wave of reform. The great abbeys of Westminster, Glastonbury and Coventry, which had stood for centuries as bastions of monastic life, found their lands and treasures seized by crown decree. Stately stone cloisters fell silent, their monks and nuns dispersed to exile in France or to seek refuge in Rome. In the ensuing months, the state meticulously reorganized the religious hierarchy. Protestant bishops, well versed in the new liturgy, were appointed to cathedrals, and Reformed clergy took up the teaching of English catechism in villages and market towns. Although Elizabeth's government bore the veneer of tolerance, allowing those of differing beliefs to worship in private, they maintained the unity of the national church to forestall any further fragmentation. It was a delicate balance, one that rested on a quiet promise. No more public burnings, but no complete freedom of conscience either. On the diplomatic front, Elizabeth deftly shifted England's alliances. She renewed treaties with France and the United Provinces of the Netherlands, signalling a move away from the austere embrace of Spain. The first letter she penned to Philip II spoke of shared commerce, of mutual benefit in trade of wool, wine and woolens, but made no mention of marriage or the old question of inheritance. The omission rankled Spanish pride, yet it opened the door to new agreements, port clearances, merchant charters, and joint ventures in the Atlantic fisheries. Thus, England asserted itself as a maritime power, her ships now free to sail under a banner of political autonomy rather than matrimonial obligation. In London's frost-chilled streets, the populace bore their joy with quiet dignity. No gala processions paraded through the narrow lanes. Instead, small groups gathered around flickering hearths and in dimly lit taverns, softly humming the refrains of psalms that had once been forbidden. At sunset, candles glimmered on windowsills, each flame an emblem of hope kindled in private hearts. Merchants and nobles no longer bowed to the visage of Mary depicted on coinage. They now carried Elizabeth's youthful portrait, her auburn hair haloed by a circlet of gold, in their purse or pocketbook. Yet the spectre of those dark days lingered. Old men and women, their once youthful eyes now lined with sorrow, recounted to grandchildren the memory of Smithfield's blazing scaffolds, the roaring heat that consumed body and soul, the terror-stricken wails that echoed off the stone walls. They spoke in hushed tones of the orange glow that had illuminated the square, and of the silent companions they carried in remembrance. A scorched fragment of a missal, a clump of ash, pressed between the pages of a worn Bible. But time, that patient healer, guided England gently toward tranquility. The shadow of Mary's reign receded as blossoms unfurled on the hedgerows and larks took to the dawn sky in joyful chorus. In the hush that followed those turbulent years, a new era of learning and artistry took root. Poets found inspiration in the soft cadences of the Reformed liturgy, and painters captured Elizabeth's visage against tapestries of rosy dawn. The sleep of the nation, once disturbed by smoke and sorrow, settled into a peaceful embrace, ushering in what future generations would call the Elizabethan age, a season of promise born from ashes, a testament to the enduring power of mercy over wrath. Outside England's shores, the reaction to Queen Mary's passing was as varied as it was dramatic. In Protestant provinces such as the United Provinces of the Netherlands, Norway and Sweden, trumpets sounded in joyous fanfare the moment word arrived. The Dutch ambassador in London dispatched urgent missives to The Hague proclaiming, "God has liberated our brethren from the flames," and celebratory banners fluttered above canals and market squares. Yet in the court at Nantes, France, where loyalties remained split between Catholicism and emerging Protestant sympathies, the response was more measured. French ministers offered condolences to the House of Tudor, careful to maintain diplomatic balance, even as their own country wrestled with sectarian division. In Rome, Pope Pius IV received the news with a mixture of relief and lament. He had previously dispatched a stern ultimatum urging Mary to temper her persecutions, warning that a single harsh sprig of asparagus can kill the mightiest oak. Now, with Mary gone, he voiced sorrow for her soul, even as he resolved to pursue a more conciliatory policy toward Elizabeth's regime. A papal bull was issued that called for prayers for Mary's eternal rest, and yet, in diplomatic correspondence, the Vatican hinted at a subtler dance, an acknowledgement that Elizabeth's gentler reforms might better preserve Catholic interests in England. Merchants and merchantmen from across Europe immediately redirected their sails toward London's reopened docks. Fleets bearing the flags of the Netherlands, France and Portugal lined the Thames, disgorging spices, fine cloth, and exotic goods once choked by fear of religious strife. The English economy, suppressed under Mary's rule, experienced a swift revival. The wool trade surged as English broadcloth found eager customers on the continent, and the newly established trading companies arranged voyages as far afield as the Baltic and the Levant. In bustling dockyards, shipwrights and coopers found ample work, while artisans in silks, timberwork and jewellery felt a renewed demand for their crafts. Workshops that had languished during years of turmoil now thrived, apprentices clamouring for positions under master craftsmen whose skills had been preserved in secret through the worst of Mary's reign. Artists and writers could not resist turning their pens to the stark contrast between Mary's era of flames and Elizabeth's dawn of reconciliation. Poetry anthologies contained verses that evoked the blackened gallows and pyres of Smithfield, the flicker of flames that devoured bodies and faith alike. But as the new queen's policies took hold, Protestant poets composed what they called the legend of the resurrection, casting Mary as one fallen from the bowels of hell, and Elizabeth as the rosy-mantled morning star. At the Globe Theatre, dramatists wove macabre vignettes of Mary's living decay into scenes of moral warning, complete with flickering lamplight that danced across rotting stage props. Indeed, a chilling reminder of zeal unbounded. Yet not all corners of Europe joined in the applause. In Scotland, Queen Mary Stuart herself, a Catholic monarch, watched with growing anxiety as Protestantism spread its roots ever deeper. She strengthened the ranks of her own Catholic lords and invoked the support of France's Valois dynasty, wary of Elizabeth's influence across the North Sea. Meanwhile, in Spain, Philip II maintained a cool equanimity. His interests lay in consolidating Habsburg power in the Netherlands, rather than reopening hostilities with England. Spanish envoys continued to negotiate trade and military pacts, but their letters bore polite distance rather than the fervent zeal of years past. Through it all, the name Mary Tudor, forever etched as Bloody Mary, remained a dark symbol in the European consciousness. Parents in town squares would caution children with tales of her pyres, an ominous lesson on the perils of unbridled faith. Scholars debated her legacy in university halls, weighing her trauma-laden childhood against the cruelty of her policies. But from those smouldering ashes, England rose stronger, entering what would be celebrated as the Elizabethan Golden Age. In the decades to follow, poets like Spenser and Marlowe, statesmen like Burghley and Essex, and explorers like Drake and Raleigh would build upon the fragile peace born in the aftermath of Mary's tragic reign, proof that even the darkest chapter can give rise to a brilliant new dawn. Centuries after her death, Mary Tudor's legacy remains a battleground for historians, divided between those who see her as tragic victim and those who hold her accountable for her reign of terror. The first camp, often labelled the tragic thesis, portrays Mary as a child of misfortune, crushed under the weight of her father's capricious ambitions and the cruel vicissitudes of Tudor politics. Born beloved of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, she was celebrated as the heir apparent until Anne Boleyn's arrival reduced her to illegitimacy and exile. Her tender years, spent under surveillance and stripped of agency, left deep psychological scars. In this view, Mary's relentless desire for a male heir and her subsequent descent into religious zeal stemmed from a lifelong need for validation. Biographers in this tradition draw parallels with Isabella of Castile and Catherine de' Medici, arguing that Mary inherited the tragic destiny, all too common to powerful women in an age that neither prized nor protected their autonomy. In sharp contrast stands the responsibility thesis, whose proponents insist that circumstance cannot excuse Mary's decisions. Regardless of her childhood trauma, they argue, Mary consciously chose policies that led to the burning of nearly 300 Protestants by public execution. Political correspondence, most notably letters to Bishop Edmund Bonner, reveals her deliberate encouragement of severe interrogations, the sanctioning of torture, and the confiscation of heretical property. For the Responsibility School, Mary's calculus was simple: cleanse the realm with fire so that souls might be saved. They maintain that she fully understood the human cost of her actions, rendering her culpable rather than pitiful. More recently, medical historians have added a new dimension to the debate by examining extant autopsy accounts and contemporary descriptions of Mary's final illness. Their consensus: she likely suffered from advanced ovarian cancer, complicated by cirrhosis of the liver, possibly exacerbated by lead-based cosmetics popular in Tudor courts. This diagnosis explains her jaundiced complexion, excruciating abdominal distension, and the grotesque skin lesions that heralded her decline. Viewed through this lens, Mary emerges as both a living case study of cancer and a victim of period beauty practices, a figure caught between malignant disease and cosmetic poison. Such analysis deepens the tragedy, portraying her not only as a political actor, but also as a body betrayed by its own frailty. In popular culture, Mary Tudor continues to fascinate as a figure of Gothic horror and historical tragedy. In the novel The Grey Walls, she is reimagined as a spectre haunting the corridors of St. James's, her decaying form a chilling allegory for religious fanaticism. On television, series like The Tudors portray her as both ruthless and pitiable, emphasizing the rotting flesh of her final days as a visual metaphor for moral corruption. Even strategy games set in Renaissance Europe allow players to enact her reign, balancing acts of persecution with diplomatic maneuvers. In each depiction, creators strive to preserve historical fact, her phantom pregnancies, her devout rituals, while amplifying the horror of her physical deterioration for dramatic effect. Despite the disparity of perspectives, one theme unites them all. Mary Tudor stands as a cautionary testament to the destructive power of fanaticism. Whether viewed as a tragic soul ensnared by birth and illness, or a monarch who wielded violence with calculated cruelty, her story underscores a timeless warning that the fusion of absolute power and unyielding creed can warp the human heart and consume any vestige of mercy. In the end, Mary's reign and her very flesh became the ultimate sacrifice to her convictions, a stark reminder that no earthly triumph can withstand the ravages of zeal or the finality of death. Through her, we learn that leaders, however crowned, remain mortal, their legacies shaped as much by suffering and choice as by the inexorable march of history. And now, as the echoes of candlelight and distant bells fade into the hush of night, we draw our tale gently to a close. Let your heart beat slow and your thoughts soften, as if you were drifting on a slow-moving river beneath the silver glow of a harvest moon. Imagine the grand halls of St. James's and Westminster Abbey receding into a mist of memory, their towering shadows dissolving into the quiet folds of evening. Through Mary's life and loss, and through Elizabeth's careful restoration, we have witnessed the power of conviction, how it can burn with righteous fire, or be tempered into the warmth of compassion, and learn that even the most formidable can falter before forces beyond their control. These stories remind us that every heart, no matter how crowned, carries its own fragility. Every reign, however mighty, must yield in time to gentler currents of mercy. Rest now in this understanding, that humanity's greatest strength lies not in unbending zeal, but in the tender capacity to forgive, to rebuild, and to embrace one another in moments of vulnerability. Allow this truth to settle, like soft petals upon your mind, soothing any lingering restlessness and guiding you toward tranquil dreams. In the deepening quiet, picture the lapping water of a sleepy pond, ripples widening slowly as moonbeams touch their edges, then vanishing peacefully. Let the memory of flames and turmoil slip away, replaced by the gentle cadence of your breath, the rise and fall of your chest like a lullaby for the soul. And as the last silhouettes of history dissolve into shadow, know that every ending is also a beginning, an invitation to carry forward the lessons learned, to temper our own passions with kindness, and to light small candles of hope in the hearts of those around us. Sleep well, dear listener, beneath the soft blanket of night. May your dreams be calm, your rest deep, and your waking gentle. If you have found comfort in this story, please subscribe to our channel so that we may share more tales, tender, haunting, and ever so soothing whenever you seek a moment's peaceful escape. Good night, and sweet whispering dreams.